January 1st, 1959. Fidel Castro becomes new leader of Cuba. December 19th, 1960. Cuba publicly supports the Soviet Union and adopts some of the Union's policies. January 1961. The United States ends diplomatic relations with Cuba, who was at the time an ally of the Soviet Union.
Guess what? I love communism. What? Communism? This is an outrage! I'm through with you and your communism practices. It's over. We're done! But I love communism!
April 17th, 1961. In an effort to rid Cuba of the Castro administration, around 1,300 Cuban exiles that were trained and supported by the American CIA invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs.
You want with me? I'm from the American CIA. We'll provide you with the necessary equipment, but it will be your job to take your country back. Okay? Here, you'll need these. You're ready. I'm ready. Yes, now go take your country. Hey, exile! For Cuba! He's down.
Castro managed to suppress the invasion and capture more than 1,000 Cuban exiles. The Truman Doctrine allowed the American CIA to aid the Cuban exiles. This was because the Truman Doctrine policy allowed the United States to support any nation or institution threatened by communism. October 1961. The United States places Jupiter missiles in Turkey to threaten Russia and contain communism as per its containment policy. November 30th, 1961. Operation Mongoose, an American operation which aimed to oust Castro from power, was launched. The operation consisted of covert actions towards the Castro regime, such as propaganda campaign and a secret program of psychological warfare. However, the operation was a failure, and Castro still remained in power in Cuba. The United States believed that it was their duty to contain communism in Eastern Europe, and that they would stop any attempt to spread the communist influence elsewhere in the world. When communism spread to Cuba, they attempted many times to thwart the communist regime in Cuba. However, they were unsuccessful in containing communism into Eastern Europe, as the country in the Western Hemisphere had fallen to communism. December 7th, 1961. Castro claims himself to support communist ideals and that he would lead Cuba to become a communist nation. This political movement reinforced the ideas contained in the Camp Thesis, that the entire world is divided into two camps during the Cold War. The two camps were the communists and the democratic nations. Cuba became a communist country in 1961, and thus became a part of the communist camp. February 7th, 1962. The United States puts into effect a total economic embargo on Cuba, forbidding all trade with the country. The Marshall Plan was a plan devised by the Americans to economically aid any country threatened by communism. However, the United States decided instead to place an economic embargo on Cuba, thus slowing down the proliferation of communist countries in the Western Hemisphere. April 1962. In order to protect the Soviet Union, Khrushchev devised a plan to establish intermediate-range Soviet missiles in Cuba. Previously, Khrushchev realized that the United States had more missile and nuclear weaponry than the Soviet Union. In addition, Soviet missiles were only capable of attacking Europe. In contrast, American missiles were powerful and technically efficient enough to assault the whole Soviet Union. Khrushchev believed that installing Soviet missiles in Cuba would provide the Soviets with the strategic missile sites within striking distance of the United States. This would increase the number of their missiles. It would also prevent the United States from launching missiles at the Soviet Union, as the United States would be threatened by Soviet missiles from a country near the United States. Summer of 1962. Fearing a second American offensive following the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, Cuba turns towards the Soviet Union for protection.
Oh, Nikita, please help me. The U.S. is going to invade Cuba. What should I do? Fear not, comrade. We are all brothers in arms. We will provide you with all the necessary equipment you need. Do not worry about it. We will help you all the way through. Thank you. No problem. Did they also mention that I love communism?
Castro eventually approved of Khrushchev's proposal to install missiles in Cuba. Thus, the Soviet Union began the construction of missile sites during July 1962. September 8th and September 16th, medium-range ballistic missiles arrived in Cuba from Russia. July 27th, 1962, Castro declared that Cuba has taken defensive measures against the United States. Castro claimed that the Soviet Union had invested huge amounts of money and time into bolstering the military capabilities of Cuba. Any attack from the United States at Cuba would result in a full-scale war. October 14th, U.S. reconnaissance planes Lockheed U-2 showed construction of a missile site in Pinar del Rio province in western Cuba. This alerted to the United States that the Soviet Union possesses missile sites in Cuba. The Kennedy administration mused about destroying the missiles by a surprise air attack on Cuba. October 16th, President John F. Kennedy is presented with pictures from the U-2 flight. John F. Kennedy is genuinely surprised that he had not expected the Soviet Union to install missiles in Cuba. Kennedy established a group of 12 of his most qualified associates, called the XCOM, to find a solution to the brewing crisis.
Mr. President, we have some very important news for you. Not right now. I'm doing important stuff. Sir, I think you need to see this. The Canadians beat us in hockey again? Oh, I'm sorry. That must be the wrong paper. Here. This is the correct paper. This is an outrage. I must settle this immediately. Well, gentlemen, seems as if we have a problem on our hands. Well, in my educated opinion, I believe that the only way to solve this problem is to launch a full-scale invasion on Cuba. I completely agree! This is exactly what we should do! Invading Cuba! That's the only way to solve this problem! Then it's settled. Let's move out!
The Soviet Union claimed that the placement of Soviet missiles in Cuba was purely for defensive purposes. The Soviet Union defended its decision using the fact that the United States had missile sites in Turkey as a reason to justify the placements of Soviet missiles in Cuba. October 19th. More U-2 flights show 4 operational sites in Cuba. U.S. military was put on high alert to enforce blockade and be ready to invade Cuba immediately if necessary. October 20th, 1962. Cuba is put under quarantine by the United States. A military blockade is imposed on Cuba, preventing anyone from leaving or entering the country. October 22nd. The discovery of the Soviet Union missiles in Cuba, as well as the American quarantine on Cuba, was televised and announced to the American public by President Kennedy at 7 p.m. A directive was sent to all U.S. forces to be on DEFCON 3 alert. The United States wanted the Soviet Union to dismantle their missiles in Cuba. Kennedy warns that any missiles launched from Cuba will be considered an attack on the United States by the Soviet Union.
Citizens of the United States, the Canadians have beaten us in hockey again. On a less important note, we have found ballistic missile sites in Cuba installed by the Soviet Union. Any missiles launched by the Soviet Union or Cuba in the Western Hemisphere will be considered as an attack on the United States. This will be met with a full retaliatory response. Thank you. That is all.
October 23rd. Joint Chief of Staff instructs the Strategic Air Command to go to DEFCON 2 for the first time in U.S. history. U.S. military command